It's an extraordinary fact, but a true one. Over 90% of all the data ever created by the human race has come in just the last 4 years. More and more of our world is online now, so it should be of no surprise that online is where our enemies now come for us, and with quite startling ferocity. I've been in the Estonian capital, Tallinn, this week, where Nato is holding its annual cyber exercise to test just how resilient the alliance is against the ever more aggressive threat of Russia and Chinese digital attacks. From Tallinn, the podcast spoke to the general who runs NATO's Cyber Operations Centre, the very front line of NATO's defences. And what he told us was really quite sobering. Welcome to The General and the Journalist. I'm Tom.
And I'm Patrick.
Patrick, we'll hear that interview in a moment. But before we do, your last but one job in the army gave you overall charge of a whole load of hugely interesting things, but one of them was Britain's cyber force. So it's an area you got to know pretty well.
Yeah, I suppose I did. I mean, I am. So let's be super clear. I'm not a deep expert, but what I was responsible for when I was running strategic command as one of the chiefs was what we call the cyber domain. So if you think about, the physical domains, air, land, sea, and space, you then have this virtual domain of cyber, which is kind of everything in terms of data, everything that's on the internet and so on. And so I was responsible for all of Defence's cyber activities, but also, interestingly, I partnered up with my counterpart, who was the director of GCHQ at the time, Jeremy Fleming, and the two of us created the UK's offensive cyber capabilities in the National Cyber Force. So I'm sort of puddle deep in knowledge, Tom, definitely not in the deep end.
You've got this wonderful phrase that you've explained to me before. The world of cyber and computers can confuse all of us who know very little about it. But you've got this wonderful phrase, it actually isn't black magic. Just explain what you mean by that.
So cyber's not black magic. And perhaps one of the ways to think about it is in the same way that you would think about a physical domain. So think about it as a landscape. Only in this landscape, nothing is fixed. So what the features that you would think of as physical geographical features, mountains, rivers, bridges, cities, in this landscape, everything can move. Everything can be created, can be destroyed, can be transient. And what's really interesting about this notion of a cyber landscape is that we don't own it. It's the large commercial ISPs, the internet service providers, who own that landscape. So you can't operate in the cyber domain either to defend yourself and secure data or to conduct offensive activities without having some form of a partnership with the likes of Microsoft. Now, they would say, we don't cooperate with governments, we protect your data, but you've got to understand what that landscape is and the influence that they have on it before you can operate in this virtual landscape.
It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? It's like two different powers fighting a war in someone else's country altogether. They're just renting bits of it.
Yes, and of course the notion of distance doesn't really apply either, because there isn't, it's because the distances are virtual. The fact that data may have been created a long way away doesn't mean it's not instantly accessible in this cyber landscape. And it's only when you try to build up walls to protect that data in a way that, clearly China has done, with sort of the Great Firewall, that you run into these barriers that prevent you from accessing it.
So where is the cyber battlefield of today? Where are the big threats coming from? What are our vulnerabilities and who are the big players? And how has this all evolved in the last decade or two since the domain really began? This is a pretty new one after all.
It is. I mean, I guess the way to think about cyber is we're now involved in constant state-on-state competition. So the main threat is strategic, persistent activity by Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, not the one-off attacks. So they're targeting our critical infrastructure, our intellectual property, our political cohesion. You've seen ransomware, it's always been ransomware, but this has now become a geopolitical tool. And of course, what's really changed is the way that AI can be applied to cyber to accelerate the scale and speed of these operations. And what's much harder is that it's attack is easier than defense. So defense is really hard at the moment. Biggest vulnerabilities, I'm pretty simple. It's having legacy systems. It's having complex supply chains where there are backdoors, and it's people like you and me, not patching. clicking on links that we shouldn't do. The 80% of the vulnerability comes from people and our behavior. The big players won't surprise you. So you've got Russia. Russia's primarily disruptive. It's destructive. Its strategy is chaos. China is much more comprehensive. It's much more long term. It's much more focused on economic advantage and access. And then Iran and North Korea basically do two things. They use cyber to try and project power, and they generate revenue. And the thing, I guess, that worries me most about cyber isn't the sort of Hollywood using cyber in a way that you would see in a film to bring down a power plant or close down train lines or whatever. You
Although
can
that
do
is still
that.
a risk.
Oh, it is, of course. I don't underplay that. So it's a threat that you have to deal with. Trying to get into SCADA systems. The systems that control these big these sort of big plants. For me, it's much more in the cognitive domain. It's using cyber and disinformation to influence how people behave. And that's how you take something that's virtual, that doesn't exist, and then you cause it to have a real world effect because you're changing people's attitudes and then you're changing their behavior.
The world of disinformation, which we do know our enemies have got really rather good at as well.
Yeah. So, Tom, you've been in Tallinn, one of my favourite cities. I spent a lot of time there visiting an exercise. What are your impressions? I'm a guess of Tallinn, but also of this exercise that you're seeing.
Well, it was cold. I tell you that much. My big takeaway, I guess, visually from the exercise, this vast cyber range. So the Estonians, as you well know, Patrick, they're a tiny little country, 1.2 million people, one of the EU's tiniest. But they are probably the EU's experts in cyber. They decided a long time ago to become just digital whiz kids. So everything is digital in Estonia. You pay your taxes online. I was talking to Estonia, he told me it took him 3 minutes to do his tax return the other day. It takes me days on end because their systems are so brilliantly digitalized. But this amazing cyber range they've got with these vast servers, the one thing that really struck out to me is the way people looked. So you had 32 different nations spread out in this vast room, all of their computers, a hushed silence as everyone's busily tapping away rather than shouting commands to each other. So it feels different to a normal military operations room. But also they look different. So you'll be pleased to hear in the corner, there were the Brits who were wearing uniform and short haircuts, etc. You would have been extremely proud of their smartness, Patrick. But then you look across the rest of the countries, at the Poles had ponytails. There was a Polish woman there with long purple hair in civilian clothing, and they looked like something more out of Silicon Valley.
I mean, it's fascinating you say that, because one of the things I tried to do when I was responsible for cyber was I wanted to create almost a separate force where you had different entry standards, different requirements, because to my mind, the sort of people who were going to be good at cyber were not necessarily the people who were good at running up hills, carrying their luggage and a weapon. So, I'm kind of in the purple hair territory.
The other thing I was really struck by, of course, is, you know this very well, the Estonians' resilience. I mean, my God, they're tough people, aren't they? Tallinn is, 100 miles from the Russian border, 200 miles away from St. Petersburg, and this vast, great country with all its aggression bearing down on them. But what they were saying is, do you know what? If the Russians invade, they come for us again, we're ready for them. We've dealt with Russia on our border coming at us for hundreds of years now, and we'll take them on. We're ready. If it happens, it happens. We're not going to sit here and worry about it. We'll fight them man to man. Really, really impressive people.
They are. And of course, we should remember that we've got a UK battle group in Estonia as part of Estonia's defence plans, and that would increase to a brigade. So if it did happen, we'd be fighting from day one. So, Tom, I mean, first of all, just for the uninitiated, when you say range, people think of golf driving range or they think of shooting range. But perhaps you can explain what a cyber range looks like, because I guess it's virtual. And then what did you actually see on the exercise?
It looked like a vast office with an awful lot of computers, a lot of wires coming in, just a lot of different people sitting at what is very powerful load of computers and a vast room. We passed the server room, which is absolutely enormous. They measure the data they keep there in terabytes, which is what the Googles, the Amazons do as well. And someone told me, it's called a cyber range. It's a cyber office, really. But someone there told me that they're only allowed to be offline for 18 hours in the year. That's because they are one of the points to go to if there is a massive cyber attack on a NATO country by one of our enemies, China or Russia, at a time of war. Then that's the place that will ramp up, and very quickly they'll fight the defense from. So they are almost at battle stations already, really. And the other point about it is it's a very highly classified place. We had to hand over our phones before we even went into the building. There were 3 different checkpoints, lots of signs on doors saying, be careful, don't do this, don't do that in there, simply because, if anybody, the cyber experts are just so aware of what our enemies can do and what they can take from us virtually. The exercise itself runs over 2 weeks. There are 7 different storylines, so they're testing out 7 different potential events, and an obvious one is an attack on CNI, critical national infrastructure attack, as we were discussing. So a power station is targeted. And it's all about cooperation amongst the 32 allies. So, who will come to so-and-so's help? How would you do that? And a really interesting thing they test is that not everyone in NATO has the same cyber capability. Some are brilliant at it, like the Americans, and we're not so bad either. Others less so. So there's a little reluctance amongst some NATO partners to share. Because why would you? Why would you want to give away billions of research and technology to a poorer country who hasn't spent anything? So it's trying to persuade them to cooperate well. And another storyline, very interesting, for the first time this year, it's an annual exercise Cyber Coalition it's called, was testing cyber in space. So the storyline was the space network had been hacked, had been infiltrated by an adversary, and everyone had to rush to try and get the adversaries out and repair all the damage. And of course, space, as well as cyber, is a brand new domain, and because it's a domain, of course, it has a cyber element to it. So it was absolutely fascinating, really.
It reminds me of a lot of the discussions I had with Cybercom and the NSA and my counterpart there, where the US at that point, I think it's changed now under President Trump, but at that point were looking to defend forward. So rather than, this is the notion that, don't defend on the goal line, get forward onto the networks where you can defend there. And the US offered lots of allies, and we did too, the ability to help defend their networks. We certainly did it for the Ukrainians before the invasion in February 22. And that's why the Russian effectiveness in their cyber attacks was more limited, because we'd already built some resilience into the Ukrainian systems. But there's a but, and here's the but. If you're going to defend forward, you're going to have to allow us onto your national networks. And people still stumble a little bit over that.
They get squeamish.
Yeah.
Because it just so happens there are things amongst NATO that not everybody is willing to share just yet.
Anyway, let's move on now. So here is Tom's interview with the Turkish Brigadier, General Ümit Ersoy, who is the chief of NATO's Cyberspace Operations Centre, or CISOC, at SHAPE. And SHAPE, for those of you who aren't spotters, is the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. And for those watching on YouTube, we are not showing you the General's face at his own request because of the very sensitive work that he does.
Obviously, this is a war ongoing, taking place on a daily basis. Without naming it as a war, our nation's facing such attacks.
And that's how General Ersoy framed the current cyber landscape. We are already at war, particularly with Russia. We just don't call it a war. Throughout our interview, General Ersoy struck me as a highly professional soldier dedicated to protecting people, but also one who's clearly feeling the pressure of an immense job that he's already done for 2 long years. I asked him what was his hardest day in the office.
Obviously, each day of mine is harder than the previous day here. Uncountable attempts are taking place here and there, and obviously, each day we excel in this business, and each day the environment is getting harder. So if you ask me, what was your hardest moment? It is now.
The severity and sheer volume of cyber attacks being directed at NATO countries is of a different order to even earlier this year. It's evident that 2025 has, to some degree at least, marked a turning point.
To compare 2-3 years back, I would say we are not in a place comparing 6 months ago. Each days go by, every day, the threat picture is evolving and changing. The threats emanating from multiple sources, state actors, non-state actors, or supported by some states, are getting more sophisticated, and the methodology, procedures, techniques, tactics used by those cyber threat actors are progressing in a massive way that we have to, at the same speed of relevance, increase our resilience, understanding, and handling matters.
It's very hard to directly attribute any cyber attack because of their complexity, but suspicion ever more falls on Russia these days, not least with its drones now over European airspace or the bombs it allegedly plants on Poland's rail track. But General Ersoy made it very clear that Russia has certainly now got its cyber game on.
Russia is very successful in this business.
How are they succeeding? What do you mean by they're very successful?
In their war against Ukraine, they simultaneously started some cyber attacks with the kinetic ones. And they did very well. And considering that cyberspace is not something that you can achieve in a blink of eye time, it means that they have worked on the subject, planned, prepared themselves. So to make it happen, a huge organization is required.
Cyber's a very interesting domain, isn't it? Because if you want to cause trouble, if you want to irritate, if you want to debilitate and even split NATO, you can do it via cyber attacks, denial of service, or on critical national infrastructure, or even an attack on someone's banking system without your fingerprints on it, can't you? So this suits Russia and General Gerasimov, his chief of general staff's game plan of war by any other means, hybrid war, perfectly, doesn't it? It's the perfect type of warfare to deploy on us where we can't actually fire anything back, largely because it's so hard to prove it's them.
We have first encountered Russian aggressive actions 2014, almost more than a decade ago. And Gerasimov doctrine that you mentioned is not something new. Just we observe how perfectly they implement that doctrine. I think this is not something makes us surprised. On the other hand, the old scholar said, that which does not kill you makes you stronger. I think we are getting more stronger, having seen Russia is excelling in this era, and that's also something that we are doing as well.
But just how deep do Russia's nefarious activities online go? It's not just espionage and attacks on our militaries. Major Western companies have been ever more successfully targeted by ransomware gangs this year. Heathrow Airport, as well as Berlin and Brussels airports, were taken out of action completely for a day in September when one gang took out their check-in systems. In the UK, MI5 has started to point the finger at Russia and China. In the UK, over the summer, we've seen a series of very damaging attacks on companies. Marks and Spencer's and most recently Jaguar Land Rover was taken offline. Their factories had to close for 6 weeks because they were hit by such a debilitating attack by a criminal gang who were asking for a huge ransom. But have you detected that these sort of criminal gangs going after big corporates for money, are they getting help from state actors, in particular the Russian state, where a lot of these criminal gangs seem to be working from?
I believe that's possible. There is nothing to prevent such an action. Obviously, we are talking about the rogue regime. So considering that a regime staging a war in one of our partners just because they find it very, so to say, immoral, they wouldn't refrain getting in touch with those criminals.
Have you had any evidence at all, even circumstantial, that they're involved with these sort of rogue gangs?
It is very hard to lay down the evidence unless you are not part of this game. It's really difficult to say.
Yeah, but it wouldn't surprise you. That's what they do. They're rogue states.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Finally, I put the question to General Ersoy that us journalists often do, but I generally really wanted to know his answer. What is your worst fear, doing the job you do, running the Cyber Operations Centre? What keeps you awake at night most when you think about the future for cyber?
Frankly, to answer your question, I would say, since I was assigned here, none of the nights I go to bed, I felt comfortable. I felt ready to sleep. Each day is a challenge for us. And the biggest fear, obviously, being under attack by those actors that we have discussed in one way or another, by using different techniques, by using different procedures and so on. we are progressing and we are evolving very fast. But until my last day at this office, I think I will keep fearing.
Patrick, I was really taken by quite a lot of what General Ersoy said, especially sort of how emotive he was about his subject matter, really. And maybe you get like that after you spend 2 years on the front line, trying to hold back defences, keeping your fingers in the dike, so to speak, of those Chinese, Russian, Iranian attacks. You must have some sympathy for what General Ersoy is going through, as he said, on a daily basis.
I do recall those same feelings myself when this was part of my responsibilities, because it's only when you're exposed to the volume and the persistence and the intensity of the attacks that we experience in cyberspace. I mean, it feels like a digital blitz. It's like a digital battle of Britain happening every single day, that you realise just how much risk there is out there, and I guess that's the biggest takeaway for me. It's the lack of awareness. And we do a good job at this in the UK. We've got the National Cybersecurity Centre, an offshoot of GCHQ, which helps government, it helps industry, it helps advise. It tries to make sure that people are tracking the threats, the threat actors, tracking the zero-day exploits that could happen, making sure that people are patching, taking all the basic cyber hygiene. But honestly, is when you dip your toe and you look into that hidden well, you see the volume of it. That's the concern.
I was so struck, to your point there, Patrick, by General Ersoy saying, my greatest worry is we're not maturing fast enough to know what's happening to us. So it's those Rumsfeldian known unknowns, isn't it? We know what is happening now, but something else has just happened. I don't know what that means. Does that mean they're going to bring down the entire network or a power station or whatever it is, or are they not? And it will breed a feeling of terrible paranoia, I suppose, and a paranoia I guess you have to be able to do that job properly. What kept you awake at night, Patrick, when you had command of Britain's cyber forces?
So what kept me awake then was this notion of using disinformation through the cyber domain, and the impact that was having, first of all, on our democratic processes, because we can point to several state-sponsored attacks on democratic processes that have happened around Europe and possibly the United States as well. And also the way that this disinformation was undermining the cohesion of our societies, with people, credulous people following conspiracy theories down rabbit holes. We saw a lot of that around COVID and disinformation around the vaccines. And that erodes the cohesion of society and it makes us weaker. So that's what used to keep me awake. I still worry about that a bit, although I think people are more alive to the presence of disinformation. People are more curious about what they're reading online than they were, more questioning. And I think what keeps me awake now is the impact of artificial intelligence agents on the cyber domain. Because, we talk glibly about the younger generation being digital natives, this being their language, an environment they grew up with. But actually AI is a true digital native. Here are entities that are created that are purely cyber. It's software, it's algorithms, it's data, it's networks. And we don't understand very often how the AIs work. So there's part of me that wants to apply AIs to defending ourselves in cyber. But I worry as much that if we don't understand how they're defending ourselves, can they evolve? How do we know that data hasn't been poisoned? And then AI being used in offensive cyber, that's very, very difficult to defend against.
It's a general lack of control, isn't it? I mean, having to have a cyber job, it's a control freak's nightmare, isn't it? Not just what the enemy is doing, but now what your own AI might be doing that be so hard to control.
What keeps you awake? And now that you've been on this exercise, Tom, you've been exposed to this, immersed in it in some detail. What was your biggest takeaway from the exercise and what worries you?
Do you know, I think it was probably the unfairness of it all, which sounds like a bit of a sort of a crass thing to say. But as General Ersoy said, we are at war with Russia in particular on a daily basis. They are attacking us. We are under attack on a daily basis. And if the sort of damage that was being done by Russia's cyber attacks and others as well was done by kinetic means, in other words, a missile or a bomb, so an airport was taken out albeit nobody killed by a bomb going off or a transport network going down or a power station being threatened by something exploding, that would be an act of war, which we'd be retaliating over, and we would be probably in armed conflict with Russia by now. But simply because it's happening via cyber in a way that we can't see, in a way that there is no big bang, they get away with it. And it's incredibly hard for us to retaliate. Now, one reason is because it's very hard to attribute, very hard to work out who's done what. But Russia, it seems to me, is exploiting our sensibilities here, even our sensitivities, our inability to call this stuff out. They are absolutely driving a double-decker bus right through, and it's escalating. And it's a really difficult problem for me, Patrick, to see where that escalation stops. They will just keep going on, doing us ever more damage. It would appear we're just having to take it.
So the positive is that NATO has got a declaratory policy of you could trigger Article 5 in the event of a cyber attack. So it's not scot-free. There are going to be costs. But the key thing you just said is attribution. If you can't attribute where a cyber attack's coming from, it's much, much harder to trigger Article 5 or to conduct counterattacks. And it's not to say that we haven't used offensive cyber capabilities against adversaries, Tom, but we haven't talked about it. And also, crucially, we've done this in a way that is legal and ethical. And it's very important that when Jeremy Fleming and I were launching the National Cyber Force, central to this was the notion that we, the UK, would be a responsible cyber power, that we would behave in line with our values.
Okay, well, that seems like a good high bit of moral ground to end on. That is it for today. If you have any questions you'd like us to answer or just want to make a point, please email us, as usual, at generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. Read them all. They're incredibly helpful. Also, do look out for the Times' weekly newsletter, War and Peace, on precisely this sort of material. Drops every Thursday, free to Times subscribers if you go online and find the subscription link on the newsletters bit on the Times site, written by yours truly. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye, Patrick.
Bye, Tom.